Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This is for Friday, December the 27th, 2024. It'll be the last Friday night we have in 2024. The next one will be in January of 2025. We had our Christmas, we opened our presents. I've got one in the other room. It's a 3D puzzle wooden kit my wife got me, and I'm in the middle of it right now, so that's not finished. My wife got something that she opened earlier because I got it out and gave it to her right away. That was another controller for her PS5. And then we got some presents from her son and his wife. Unfortunately, we got them a present and put it in the mail, and I forgot to put a stamp on it, so it got put back in our mailbox. So they may not get that until this weekend or even Monday. We'll see. It is wet outside as we record this. I don't think it's raining, but it apparently rained overnight, so it is wet. I wanted to take you on a little journey I took last weekend or early this week. I tend to get started on things and kind of follow them where they lead and end up in very unexpected places. And I had finished playing through a copy of Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, or in the German Lieder ohne Wörter. And my mother had two copies of it. I found one of them in my mother's music as I was going through the music in the attic looking for things. And so I brought it down and been playing through it. I used to play out of it years ago, just before I started college when we lived in Michigan. And actually on the very piano that's now sitting here in my living room. So I was kind of familiar with it, and I'm not very good at it, but I like to play through it because I like his music, and I can kind of pick up his music even if I'm not very good at playing it. Nobody else would want to listen, but it's, for my own amusement and the amazement of others, kind of a thing.
Did you say amazement?
Huh?
Did you say amazement?
Yeah, well, that's a saying I heard when I was younger, yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, as I was closing it up, I noticed that there was a stamp or a rubber stamp mark on the front page that listed the company where the book was purchased. And it was the John, I forgot the last name, do something, music company. And so I put the address into Google Earth and looked up the place, and I couldn't tell if there was a place there anymore. It is on Grand Avenue in Los Angeles, and the address was 625. 624 Grand Avenue across the street is the One Wiltshire building, which stands on Grand Avenue right where Wiltshire Boulevard comes to its eastern end. And I don't know, maybe the Wiltshire Boulevard was not there at the time because Google Earth showed me the number right in the middle of the beginning of Wiltshire Boulevard, there where it intersects Grand Avenue. I got into Street View, I looked, I saw these things, I saw a building across the street, but when I looked at the number on the door, it didn't say, it said 601. And wait a minute, what's that? Well, I got to looking around and found out that's 601 Wiltshire Boulevard, not Grand Avenue. So hard to say whatever happened to the music company, if it was in one of the buildings that's there or if it was in a building that's no longer there. It apparently moved because what I did next was do a search for the name. I came up with a whole bunch of people with that name, and it's sending me to LinkedIn and Facebook and other places where people with that name have things. So to refine the search, I put in Los Angeles. Well, then it came up with some interesting things. For example, there was a blog by a musician about a particular piece of music, and he talked about how he first encountered the piece of music It was at this man's music store next to a record store. This was in 1968. Now, the date on my mother's book, she wrote her name and the date in it, is 1949. That was while she was in college. So this is, like 19 years later, 1968, this guy goes into this man's shop and he finds this score, and the guy suggests that he buy the score. And he did, and he's like a piece of music. That was what the blog was about. So, well, I found that interesting because it suggested to me, based on where he said the shop was, that it had moved from the Grand Avenue location that's stamped in the book. The other thing that came up was a Southern California University site about architecture, and it had both a drawing and a black and white photograph of a house built for this person, this John the, yeah, it escapes my mind what his name was. I don't remember why, but anyway. And I thought, well, that would be interesting to find. Well, about the only I couldn't find an address on it. About the only thing I could find about it was that it was down the hill from the Frank Lloyd Wright Freeman house. Well, I put that into Google Earth, and it came up with the Samuel Freeman house up in the Hollywood Hills area. Well, I spent quite a bit of time looking around trying to find this house because I had the black and white picture, so I had an idea what it looked like, and I wasn't finding it. But eventually I did find it, and I am going to go into this mode here so that you can see my Google Earth. I've got the house visible in this thing. My hand there is right over where the house is, and we can kind of zoom in. You see that green roof. That green roof is roofing material that's wrapped over, and I'm going to now go into Street View. The only way you can see it is from this street here, which is Highland Avenue. So let's go into Street View here on Highland Avenue, and if I've done that right, we'll be able to swing around, and there it is, that yellow looking house with the red, might be redwood windows on it, and you see that raised portion there with roofing material used as siding. Now let's go ahead and zoom in on this so you can see it a little better. This house was designed for this music store owner by Rupert Schindler. Rupert Schindler was an Austrian architect who came to the United States about 1914. He came in part because he wanted to make contact with Frank Lloyd Wright, and it took a while, but eventually he worked for Frank Lloyd Wright. He was kind of overseeing the American operations for Mr. Wright when Mr. Wright was in Tokyo on the Imperial Hotel project. This house that you see here to the right of that sign, that yellow, red, and green thing, was designed, as I say, for this music company owner. It's a duplex. There's a one-bedroom apartment in the first floor and a two-bedroom apartment on the second floor. It was designed in 1935. And if you see up here above that, you can see that kind of concrete block structure. That is part of the Freeman house that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. Well, I got into looking into this Rupert Schindler. And like I say, this was 1935. He ended up being sent to California by Frank Lloyd Wright to oversee construction of a house that Mr. Wright had designed for an oil heiress. And he did that. He liked the area, he liked the people, and he stayed there, and he essentially went into business for himself there. So now we're going to get out of that view because I found some other houses that this man had designed, and I'm going to show you a couple of places. One of them is a beach house that he did for the Lovell family way back in 1922. Now this is down at Newport Beach, which is down in this area, and it's on this peninsula, and I've looked it up before so I can pretty much zoom right to it. So it is known to the architecture world as the Lovell Beach House. And it's a modern design, particularly for 1922. And you can see it here. It's on the right. Those green windows and then the white concrete architecture. And one of the big features of the house was these 5 figure-8 concrete supports that put the living quarters up away from the street. And the Lovell family, I'm told, still owns, come on, this Google Earth is being cranky here. I wanted to back away some so you could see a little bit more of it. There's a 2-story living room, dining room area there in that corner. And then there's a yard before you get to the beach. So you can see why it's called a beach house. It's right on the beach. My guess is that's nowadays, given its history, it's worth multiple millions of dollars sitting there next to the beach. So that was one of the things he designed. He designed quite a number of houses, mostly houses. As time went on, though, he found out that in the Los Angeles area there were a lot of people with style who didn't have a lot of money. And this type of construction with the poured in place concrete was expensive to do. So he began using less expensive materials like wood, coating it with plaster. Similar designs, but less expensive to produce. And let's go reset things here. In his career, Mr. Schindler designed one church. And I was able to find that. They actually gave an address for it, but it took me a little looking to find it. That's on Compton Avenue, just south of downtown Los Angeles. And let's see, I think, this is Compton Avenue here. It's 4900 Compton Avenue, and as I zoom in, I don't know if you can read it, but you can see a little mark here over this building, and it says Optima Funeral Home. Now, the address they gave was 4900, which is over here. However, the address for this structure, which is the structure that he designed, as I was able to confirm later, is 4901 Compton Avenue. And we'll go into street view there, and you can see that again, this is not a huge thing, not as big as you might imagine for a church, but it is a very similar architectural style. Come on. If I go funny like that, Google Earth doesn't like to read my clicks. It wants to read my clicks when it's in normal mode. So let's see if I can. It's just really being grouchy today. Come on. There. And you see that what's supposed to pass for a steeple there. That was one feature of the thing. This was built for the Bethlehem Baptist Church. It fell into disuse. It was added to a register of historic places, and it was restored by a faith group. And nothing that I read mentioned the current occupant, this Optima Funeral Home. I did find a website for Optima Funeral Home, and I looked over it, and they say absolutely nothing about the building they're located in. They're just, touting their services and giving you links to obituaries and information like that, like a normal funeral home would do. But anyway, so those were some things I found out, and it was an interesting peek into architecture. This church was actually designed in the 1940s. Mr. Schindler lived until 1953. He passed away. He was still rather young because he was born in 1887. But so that was an interesting little virtual trip that I took this week, based just on the image of a rubber stamp in a book. So, yeah. We are nearing the end of the book of Judges. There are only 2 chapters left, so when we get into our study tonight, we will probably go on into, I doubt we'll finish, but get on into the book of Ruth. Now, as before, I said that the book of Judges was a case of Israelite men behaving badly, very badly, and we kind of reached the epitome of that last week when we read chapter 19 and the story of the Levite's concubine and how the young men of Gibeah, a city in Benjamin, reenacted the scenes of Sodom because of their hatred for the other in this case being the Levite from Ephraim. So let's go ahead and bow our heads and we'll begin tonight's study. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you for the wonders of life, even on this sin-stricken planet. We thank you for your goodness and your love. And we want to understand that love. We want to understand your character and your goodness better. And even though we're reading through a section of the Bible that talks about some very negative things, help us to see the beauty of your character despite this. We ask this through the Holy Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen. So, switching to our normal Friday night view, we are ready for Judges chapter 20. You recall that at the end of the story of the Levite and his concubine and the assault there in Gibeah, that the Levite took the body of his wife home with him, cut it up into 12 pieces, and sent it out to the 12 tribes. And they responded, who's going to do something about this? So now we're reading on in this story. Then all the Israelites were united as one man, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. Now I think that's the first case in the Old Testament where we've run across that saying, from Beersheba to Dan, or Dan to Beersheba, encompassing the entirety of Israel. Recall that Beersheba is the well where Abraham made the covenant, so Beer being well, Sheba, it was the well of the covenant or the treaty, and that's considered the southernmost point in Israel, with Dan, after the events that we read last week about Micah and his idols and so forth, the tribe of Dan moved to territory in the north, and the city of Laish became their city Dan and became the northernmost edge of Israelite territory at the time. So, including those from across the Jordan in the land of Gilead, that is the Transjordan tribes, the entire community assembled in the presence of the Lord at Mizpah. The leaders of all the people and all the tribes of Israel, 400,000 warriors armed with swords, took their positions in the assembly of the people of God. Word soon reached the land of Benjamin that the other tribes had gone up to Mizpah. The Israelites then asked how this terrible crime had happened. The Levite, the husband of the woman who had been murdered, said, "My concubine and I came to spend the night in Gibeah, a town that belongs to the people of Benjamin. That night, some of the leading citizens of Gibeah," well, I'm not sure if it was leading citizens, but he's going to word it that way, "surrounded the house, planning to kill me, and they raped my concubine until she was dead." Well, they weren't planning to kill him. They were planning to humiliate him by having sex with him. But he says they were planning to kill him.
He lied.
Yeah, well, he's telling the truth about them raping his concubine until she was dead. They did essentially accomplish that. "So I cut her body into 12 pieces and sent the pieces throughout the territory assigned to Israel, for these men have committed a terrible and shameful crime. Now then, all of you, the entire community of Israel, must decide here and now what should be done about this." And all the people rose to their feet in unison and declared, "None of us will return home. No, not even one of us. Instead, this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will draw lots to decide who will attack it. 1/10 of the men from each tribe will be chosen to supply the warriors with food, and the rest of us will take revenge on Gibeah of Benjamin for the shameful thing they have done in Israel." Now, we just passed 2 footnotes. Footnote A says that what the Hebrew says is 1 man out of 10, 10 men out of 100, 100 men out of 1,000, and 1,000 men out of 10,000. But the point is, it's 1/10, so why not shorten it? I think that's a very viable translation decision to simplify things by simply to say what everything that they said actually means. The other footnote is after Gibeah, and that is telling us that there's a variant of Gibeah. I think it's Geba that's actually used in the Hebrew. And in fact, let me scroll down there because it mentions that, yes, yeah, in this case, a variant spelling of Gibeah. Okay, so the people of Gibeah engage in violence to further whatever ends they had, probably mostly xenophobic ends that they had. So the rest of Israel decides, well, the way to deal with violence is with more violence. So we're going to go to war against Benjamin. Now, they do make an offer. The Israelites sent messengers to the tribe of Benjamin saying, "What a terrible thing has been done among you. Give up those evil men, those troublemakers from Gibeah, so we can execute them and purge Israel of this evil." Now, that's an understandable mindset given the language in the books of Moses, where it talks about executing the death penalty and purging the evil from among you.
If they were going to get rid of the evil, they needed to get rid of that man who offered his wife.
Well, absolutely, and you cannot purge a territory of evil by engaging in evil. It doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
So, yeah, but that's what they're doing. This is the Old Testament telling us what happened, and I can say at this point, at least, they're accurately just telling us what happened and not telling us why or who wanted it to happen.
They acted in accordance with human nature.
Yeah, that's what they did. That's human nature. Something bad happens, you seek revenge. You do something bad to somebody else. Somehow two wrongs make a right. That is the fundamental premise behind our system of justice. If you do something wrong, well, do something wrong to you, and that'll set it right. Two wrongs make a right. Yeah, we would argue against that when we put it that way, but that is essentially what it is. And we point out, as we do with this issue of government and commerce, these things, they're not God's ideal, but they are necessary given the fallen state of humanity. So we go along with them. We pay for the things that we use. We obey the laws that the authorities impose on us because we act out of love and we go along with the system that's there. We don't agree that it's an ideal system, but we go along with it for the sake of acting out God's character on this earth. And so the same is true of our justice system. Our justice system, our society wouldn't work without it. Chaos and anarchy would result if we didn't. I'm just pointing out the absurdity of it. So anyway, so that's the way they're thinking, and that's what they're doing. So they're telling the tribe of Benjamin, if you hand over to us the men responsible, we'll deal just with them and not with the entire tribe. But it says at the end of verse 13, the people of Benjamin would not listen. Instead, they came from their towns and gathered at Gibeah to fight the Israelites. In all, 26,000 of their warriors, armed with swords, arrived in Gibeah to join the 700 elite troops who lived there. Among Benjamin's elite troops, 700 were left-handed, and each of them could sling a rock and hit a target within a hair's breadth without missing. Israel had 400,000 experienced soldiers armed with swords, not counting Benjamin's warriors. So now we're getting the military details here. Before the battle, the Israelites went to Bethel and asked God which tribe should go up first to attack the people of Benjamin. The answer they got, which they assumed was the Lord answering, was Judah is to go first. So the Israelites left early the next morning and camped near Gibeah. Then they advanced toward Gibeah to attack the men of Benjamin. But Benjamin's warriors, who were defending the town, came out and killed 22,000 Israelites on the battlefield that day. Now, even by modern standards, that is a high casualty count. 22,000 out of 400,000. That's over 5%. And since only Judah went, it's probably a much higher loss percentage. So they're going here to deal with a problem, and it's being very costly. But the Israelites encouraged each other and took their positions again at the same place they had fought the previous day. For they had gone up to Bethel and wept in the presence of the Lord until evening. They had asked the Lord, should we fight against our relatives from Benjamin again? And the answer they got, which they assumed because they're Jewish, that this is what God was telling them. The Lord had said, go out and fight against them. So the next day they went out again to fight against the men of Benjamin. But the men of Benjamin killed another 18,000 Israelites. So now out of the entire Israelite army we've had 10% casualties, all of whom were experienced with a sword. Excuse me. Then all the Israelites went up to Bethel and wept in the presence of the Lord and fasted until evening. They also brought burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord, where God's not helping us out, so we're going to try and buy his favor and his assistance. The Israelites went up seeking direction from the Lord. In those days, the Ark of the Covenant was in Bethel, and Phinehas, son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron, was the priest. Now that's, I don't know if the same place is sometimes called Bethel and sometimes called Shiloh. We read earlier that it was at Shiloh. Maybe they called Bethel Shiloh. Maybe that's a symbolic name. At any rate, Phinehas, son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron, was the priest. The Israelites asked the Lord, should we fight against our relatives from Benjamin again, or should we stop? And the answer they got, which they assumed was something that the Lord said, go, tomorrow I will hand them over to you. So the Israelites set an ambush all around Gibeah. They went out on the third day and took their positions at the same place as before. When the men of Benjamin came out to attack, they were drawn away from the town, and as they had done before, they began to kill the Israelites. About 30 Israelites died in the open fields and along the roads, one leading to Bethel and the other leading back to Gibeah. Then the warriors of Benjamin shouted, we're defeating them as we did before. But the Israelites had planned in advance to run away so that the men of Benjamin would chase them along the roads and be drawn away from the town. So this is the same strategy that Joshua used to defeat Ai. They fled from the defending soldiers, led them away from the city, and then another contingent ran in and took the city. When the main group of Israelite warriors reached Baal Tamar, they turned and took up their positions. Meanwhile, the Israelites hiding in ambush to the west of Gibeah jumped up to fight. Now there's a footnote there, and this is going to go into the different versions of the Old Testament available to us. They said to the west, as in the Greek and Syriac versions and also the Latin Vulgate. Although why they mention the Latin Vulgate, I don't know. The Latin Vulgate is a Latin translation from the manuscripts they had available at the time. The Hebrew reads, hiding in the open space instead of from the west. So it may have been on the west. Both might be right, but there is that difference in the various manuscripts we have available. Meanwhile, the Israelites hiding in the open space, or the ambush to the west of Gibeah, jumped up to fight. There were 10,000 elite Israelite troops who advanced against Gibeah. The fighting was so heavy that Benjamin didn't realize the impending disaster. So the Lord, they think, helped Israel defeat Benjamin, and that day the Israelites killed 25,100 of Benjamin's warriors, all of whom were experienced swordsmen. Then the men of Benjamin saw that they were beaten. Now, do I recall correctly? They were able to bring 26,000 to battle. Yeah, 26,000. So now they've only got 900 left. And, yeah, okay. So they saw that they were beaten. The Israelites had retreated from Benjamin's warriors in order to give those hiding in ambush more room to maneuver against Gibeah. Then those who were hiding rushed in from all sides and killed everyone in the town, just like they did with Ai. They had arranged to send up a large cloud of smoke from the town as a signal, again, just like they did at Ai. When the Israelites saw the smoke, they turned and attacked Benjamin's warriors. By that time, Benjamin's warriors had killed about 30 Israelites, and they shouted, "We're defeating them as we did in the first battle." So we go back to the narrative that we interrupted earlier when we, up here at verse 32, when we stopped to talk about the ambush. But when the warriors of Benjamin looked behind them and saw the smoke rising into the sky from every part of the town, the men of Israel turned and attacked. At this point, the men of Benjamin became terrified because they realized disaster was close at hand. So they turned around and fled before the Israelites toward the wilderness. But they couldn't escape the battle, and the people who came out of the nearby towns were also killed. Footnote D, the meaning of the battle, for the people from the nearby towns also came out and killed them. Well, it depends on where they are. I wouldn't imagine the Benjamites would come out and attack Benjamite soldiers, but if they're going through other territory, it might. Or, as this version has decided to put it, the people who came out from the nearby towns were also killed. So maybe there were Benjamites coming out, and the Israelites were worried they might try to assist the Benjamite soldiers, so they killed the townspeople as well.
Snark.
Huh?
Insert snark here.
What snark are you going to insert?
I'm not going to. It isn't nice.
Oh, all right. The Israelites surrounded the men of Benjamin and chased them relentlessly, finally overtaking them east of Gibeah. Footnote E, the meaning of the Hebrew for that is uncertain. That day, 18,000 of Benjamin's strongest warriors died in battle. The survivors fled into the wilderness toward the rock of Rimmon, but Israel killed 5,000 of them along the road. So 18,000 and 5,000 is 23,000. They continued the chase until they had killed another 2,000. Now we're up to the 25,000 near Gidom. So that day the tribe of Benjamin lost 25,000 strong warriors armed with swords, leaving only 600 men who escaped to the rock of Rimmon, where they lived for 4 months. And the Israelites returned and slaughtered every living thing in all the towns, the people, the livestock, and everything they found. They also burned down all the towns they came to. So this was a scorched earth battle. They wiped out the army, then they went through and wiped out the citizenry and burned all the towns. Can someone say disproportionate?
No, I can't say it.
Yeah.
I tried.
You know, the Benjamites tried to humiliate one man, rape and murder his concubine, one woman. And the answer is to essentially wipe out the entire tribe. Only 600 men left. The rest of the army killed, the rest of the citizenry killed, the cities burned. There's not a lot left. So now we deal with that mess. The Israelites had vowed at Mizpah, "We will never give our daughters in marriage to a man from the tribe of Benjamin." Now the people went to Bethel and sat in the presence of God until evening, weeping loudly and bitterly. O Lord God of Israel, they cried out, why has this happened in Israel? Now one of our tribes is missing from Israel. Well, how'd that happen? You're crying to God about it, but it's your doing. You're the ones who decided on this disproportionate response. Now you're going to go to God and cry about it? Early the next morning, the people built an altar and presented their burnt offerings and peace offerings on it. Then they said, who among the tribes of Israel did not join us at Mizpah when we held our assembly to the presence of in the presence of the Lord? At that time they had taken a solemn oath in the Lord's presence, vowing that anyone who refused to come would be put to death. The Israelites felt sorry for their brother Benjamin and said, today one of the tribes of Israel has been cut off. How can we find wives for the few who remain, since we have sworn by the Lord not to give them our daughters in marriage?
Now, I know how.
How?
Kidnap somebody.
You're ahead of the story here, but yes. That's the second approach. The first approach is a little different. So they asked, who among the tribes of Israel did not join us at Mizpah when we assembled in the presence of the Lord? And they discovered that no one from Jabesh Gilead had attended the assembly, for after they counted all the people, no one from Jabesh Gilead was present. Jabesh Gilead is going to be a pretty significant city in the history of Israel going forward, particularly in the stories of Saul and David, but in other instances as well. So the assembly sent 12,000 of their best warriors to Jabesh Gilead with orders to kill everyone there, including women and children. This is what you are to do, they said, completely destroy all the males and every woman who is not a virgin.
Now, how are they going to find that out?
I don't know. Completely destroy, and that footnote A almost certainly is going to say that this is a harem, the irrevocable giving order of things or persons to the Lord, often by totally destroying them. All the males and every woman who was not a virgin. Among the residents of Jabesh Gilead, they found 400 young virgins who had never slept with a man, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh in the land of Canaan. So the answer to solve the problem of genocide and excessive murder is to engage in more murder, huh?
Right.
That's how they're thinking, unfortunately. The Israelite assembly sent a peace delegation to the remaining people of Benjamin who were living at the rock of Rimmon. Then the men of Benjamin returned to their homes, and the 400 women of Jabesh Gilead who had been spared were given to them as wives. But there were not enough women for all of them. Remember, there were 600 men there, and only 400 women from Jabesh Gilead, so we've only got 2/3 of the required number. The people felt sorry for Benjamin because the Lord had made this gap among the tribes of Israel.
Well, I don't think the men back then knew how to iron their shirts.
Oh, because they didn't have wives?
Yeah.
Yeah. The people felt sorry for Benjamin because the Lord had made this gap among the tribes of Israel. So the elders of the assembly asked, how can we find wives for the few who remain, since the women of the tribe of Benjamin are dead? There must be heirs for the survivors so that the entire tribe of Israel is not wiped out. But we cannot give them our own daughters in marriage because we have sworn with a solemn oath that anyone who does this will fall under God's curse. Then they thought of the annual festival of the Lord held in Shiloh, south of Lebanon and north of Bethel, along the east side of the road that goes from Bethel to Shechem. So there we get that Bethel and Shechem are separate places. Bethel and Shiloh are separate places. but both are stated as the place where the tent tabernacle, the temple was. They told the men of Benjamin who still needed wives, "Go and hide in the vineyards. When you see the young women of Shiloh come out for their dances, rush out from the vineyards, and each of you can take one of them home to the land of Benjamin to be your wife. And when their fathers and brothers come to us in protest, we will tell them, 'Please be sympathetic. Let them have your daughters, for we didn't find wives for all of them when we destroyed Jabesh Gilead. And you are not guilty of breaking the vow, since you did not actually give your daughters to them in marriage.' So the men of Benjamin did as they were told. Each man caught one of the women as she danced in the celebration and carried her off to be his wife." What does that say about the value of a woman in those days?
No value whatsoever.
Yeah.
Actually, the woman was probably going to be sold by her father. So what they did was steal from the father.
Yeah. They returned to their own land, and they rebuilt their towns and lived in them. Then the people of Israel departed by tribes and families, and they returned to their own homes. And then the final verse of the book, repeating this mantra that's been repeated several times in these last chapters. In those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes.
And the king is supposedly going to have a good conscience.
Well, that's kind of what the rest of the Old Testament history is for, to tell us what life was like once they elected a king.
Well, they're saying that they're misbehaving because they don't have a king. And yet, when they got a king, I'm not aware that the king was such a fine, upstanding person himself.
Well, and even if he was, the people pretty much continued to misbehave just as they always had. The only thing was, now we had government in place to ward off the worst effects of living on a sinful planet. So, yeah. And, yeah. So there's a sense in which these last few chapters of the book of Judges give us a picture of human nature vacant some kind of controlling structure that we call government. If you let people do whatever seems right in their own eyes, well, they'll do whatever they want, and they will be able to justify it.
I think the beauty of God's original design is that He planned for us to be able to do whatever we wanted.
And have it be right and good.
Process, including ourselves.
Right. But when humans are sinful, that doesn't work. And that is
simple. We're focused on ourselves, not the other person.
And that is why the future world, when God has dealt with sin and eradicated it from the universe, will be great. It's not because God has a better form of government, it's because the people will be fixed and we won't need it. And we won't be trying to control each other. We'll be totally free to live our lives, and we can live in that freedom and the confidence that we are living as we were designed to live, and in a way that works, not in a way that ends up in things like this happening. And people talk about freedom in our world. Freedom means being able to do whatever you want. Well, yeah, it does, but in our world, that's not quite freedom. Real freedom is being able to do whatever you want in the full confidence that nobody will be hurt in the process. And that's not a freedom we can have until we have let God set us free from sin. So, with Judges out of the way, we get into the book of Ruth. A lot of people have very positive connotations when they think of the book of Ruth. They think of it as a love story. Well, there might be a little bit of that in it. Primarily, it's here to set the stage for the story of David. And this is not placed in a chronological context, other than it starts out in the days when the judges ruled in Israel. Which judge, they don't say. Was this between the events of Judges and the events of 1 Samuel? Probably not. It was probably somewhere earlier in the story of the Judges. And we'll look at the evidence that's available and the chronologies of what's going on. And we'll look at the story and we'll talk about the character that gets revealed and the meaning of some of the elements of the story. At any rate, in the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem. Ephraim was descendant of the tribe of Judah, and his people settled in the Bethlehem area. In the New Testament, Bethlehem is called Bethlehem Ephrathah, or the city of the Ephrathites. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah, and when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone without her 2 sons or her husband. Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. The famine was over. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab to return to her homeland. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she set out from the place where she had been living, and they took the road that would lead them back to Judah. But on the way, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. Now, one element I see here that may not have been that unusual for the time, but certainly is highly unusual in our time, and that is the positive relationship between these 2 daughters-in-law and their mother-in-law, Naomi. They were both prepared to go back to Israel with her, although why isn't clear. But she's trying to be nice, and she says to them, there's not a whole lot for you where I'm going. You stand a better chance of getting remarried and having a good life if you go back to your own country.
Well, you got to put yourself in the shoes of the daughter-in-law if you found yourself in that position. How had the mother-in-law treated the daughter-in-law, and how compassionate was the daughter-in-law toward the mother-in-law? And I had a whole lot of problems with my first mother-in-law. I couldn't abandon her. If I were in that situation, I wouldn't abandon her.
Mm-hmm. Well, you had problems with your second mother-in-law too. Maybe not as serious, but
I did with the first one, and I wouldn't abandon either one of them.
right.
I there's a thing there called common courtesy, human compassion, and as this world ages, we're seeing less and less and less of it.
Well, reading on in verse 10. No, they said, we want to go with you to your people. But Naomi replied, why should you go on with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible, and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me. Well, there's some fatalist thinking for you. If things go good, well, God blesses. If things go bad, well, God raised his fist against me. That's just how they thought in those days. And to a certain extent, there's people who still think that way.
Are they paying tithe or not?
Yeah, right.
Snark, snark. I was being nasty when I made that comment.
Yeah.
Just so you'll know.
Which reminds me, I had intended to study the issue of. Oh, I know. I said we'd make that a sermon presentation sometime. We get around to that later, I guess. We're going to cover the different instructions regarding tithe in the Old Testament. So.
It's not what your pastor has taught you.
No. At any rate, that's how Naomi saw it. She had a bad life. Well, God had raised his fist against her. And again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. Look, Naomi said to her, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same. But Ruth replied, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us.
Naomi no longer had a son to look or a husband to look after her. All she had was her daughters-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
And Ruth recognized that.
Yeah.
And as limited as she was in her ability to take care of her mother-in-law, she did not shirk that responsibility.
That's right.
I shudder to think of an older woman in that day traveling by herself.
Now, one of the elements of this, and this is an element that attracts a lot of attention, is when Ruth says, "Your God will be my God." Well, that, religion is a cultural thing, and if you're going to adapt to another culture, you generally adapt to their religion as well. And so in this case, she's essentially stating, she's going to make a commitment to Naomi's culture, including her God. But I wonder if perhaps she had seen something in her mother-in-law's character that led her to believe that her mother-in-law's God should be preferred to the gods of her own people. Your God will be my God. Doesn't tell us, it just tells us what happened. But that's a possibility. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. So the two of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. "Is it really Naomi?" the women asked. "Don't call me Naomi," she responded. "Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me." Remember, they called that place in the desert Mara because the water was bitter. Naomi means pleasant and Mara means bitter, is the footnote there for that. "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer?" Well, we're going to assert it wasn't the Lord that did that. It's just their Hebrew way of looking at things that said it was the Lord that did that. It was just the troubles of living in a sin-ridden world where sickness and death happen that caused these things to happen. "Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me?" So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring, at the beginning of the barley harvest. So the barley would have been a winter crop like winter wheat. You plant it in the fall and it sits dormant and grows some through the winter, and then it grows and ripens in the spring. So in late spring, it's time to harvest it. I think it is winter wheat that is most often grown in the United States. There were groups, and I actually considered looking into this. I never actually contacted anybody, but there were groups that would travel from Texas up through to North Dakota following the wheat harvest. And essentially it'd be a guy who owned the combines to actually harvest the wheat, and then trucks to haul the grain, and would hire people to do the physical labor involved and to operate the equipment. And they would take all this stuff and they would travel and follow the wheat harvest north and harvest the wheat for various farmers. The owner would have to go out and arrange contracts, and then you do this work every day, and at the end of the thing, you get up north, then all the workers would be laid off to go do something else, and the equipment would be returned to Texas for the next year. Like I said, I never actually contacted any, but I knew there were places like that, and I thought it might be an interesting thing to do. I just never did it. But I think that would follow winter wheat, so it would start in the spring in Texas and work through. They might do another run for the summer wheat, which would be harvested then in the fall.
You know what?
What?
I'm sitting here rocking, and I have rocked myself to sleep almost.
Good night.
let me get my nap before Ellen gets here.
Okay.
And if the exterminator shows up, make sure I'm covered, please.
Okay.
Night.
Are you hanging up?
Uh, you can hang up for me.
Okay.
Are you there?
Yeah, and I was trying to swipe up to get the phone open, and it opened, and I swiped the phone app away, and now I don't know how to get back to it.
Leave it on and I'll just listen to you. Well, I text out.
All right.
Night.
All right, well, we're ready to move on to the next chapter anyway, Ruth chapter 2. Now, there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech, so he's also an Ephrathite. One day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." This is a procedure called gleaning. It was ordered in the laws of the books of Moses. And they were specifically instructed not to reap to the edges of the fields and to allow the poor people to go behind the reapers and pick up what was left, to glean the remainder, so that the poorer people would find sustenance, would be able to survive. And so that's what she's doing. She became aware of this custom amongst the Israelites, and she wants to help her mother-in-law out, and so she says, "Listen, I'll go do that." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. So they're making an outward show of their religious devotion. Then Boaz asked his foreman, "Who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" And the foreman replied, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She's been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes' rest in the shelter." Boaz went over and said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. "What have I done to deserve such kindness?" she asked. "I'm only a foreigner." "Yes, I know," Boaz replied, "but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother in your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done." "I hope I continue to please you, sir," she replied. "You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers." At mealtime, Boaz called to her, "Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine." So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. Now, we know how the story turns out, so we wonder as we read this, was Boaz intentionally being nice to this lady and asking her to stay there because he was interested in her? Hard to say. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather grain among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time. So he's essentially giving this gleaner a little preferential treatment. Now, is he doing this out of obligation to Naomi, or is there another motive behind what he's doing? So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket, or about an ephah, which would be 20 quarts or about 22 liters. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. "Where did you gather all this grain today?" Naomi asked. "Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you." So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked. She said, "The man I worked with today is named Boaz." "May the Lord bless him," Naomi told her daughter-in-law. "He is showing kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family's redeemers." Now this brings in the concept of the kinsman redeemer. The Hebrew says to the living and the dead there in place of kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. They're being interpreted. That's what this version likes to do. The closest relative, one of our family's redeemers. The kinsman redeemer is the role that Boaz is going to play in the rest of this story. Then Ruth said, Ruth the Moabite is what the Hebrew says. "What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with these harvesters until the entire harvest is completed." "Good," Naomi exclaimed. "Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with these young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields. I mean, we know what happened in Benjamin. There was a lot of xenophobia going on, so if she went other places, she might be harassed because she was an Israelite." So, Ruth sees that Boaz doesn't share that kind of stuff, that he'll treat her well. She wants her to stay around that and not be in places where things might not go as well for her. So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's fields and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them throughout the wheat harvest in early summer, and all the while she lived with her mother-in-law. So she's doing what she had committed to do, which is continue to care for her mother-in-law. In that world, women didn't have rights. They couldn't own property. They didn't get jobs. They were expected to stay home. So if a woman didn't have a husband, she was in a bad place. And so now you've got a pair of widows living together and doing what people did in that time to survive. And our story continues. One day Naomi said to Ruth, "My daughter, it's time that I found a permanent home for you so that you will be provided for." In other words, she wants to find her a husband because that's how women get provided for in that world. "Boaz is a close relative of ours, and he's been very kind by letting you gather grain with his young women. Tonight he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. Now, do as I tell you. Take a bath, put on perfume, and dress in your nicest clothes. Then go to the threshing floor, but don't let Boaz see you until he has finished eating and drinking. Be sure to notice where he lies down. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down there. He will tell you what to do." Now, this bit about uncovering the feet and laying down there must have been something of cultural significance to them that this book doesn't bother to explain. And maybe when it was written, the author expected that the people who read it would understand the practice and the cultural norms thus being invoked, would know what it meant. we're not so clear on it in our day. And she's also making sure that he doesn't see her until she gets there and lies down. And I'm not sure what she's thinking about there, but that's what she instructs Ruth to do. I will do everything you say, Ruth replied. So she went down to the threshing floor that night and followed the instructions of her mother-in-law. After Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he lay down at the far end of the pile of grain and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a young woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she replied. "Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer," or kinsman redeemer. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," Boaz exclaimed. "You are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. Now, don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do what is necessary, for everyone in town knows you are a virtuous woman. But while it's true that I am one of your family's redeemer, there is another man who is more closely related to you than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning I will talk to him. If he is willing to redeem you, very well, let him marry you. But if he is not willing, then as surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you myself. Now, lie down here until morning." So Ruth lay at Boaz's feet until the morning, but she got up before it was light enough for people to recognize each other, for Boaz had said, "No one must know that a woman was here at the threshing floor." Then Boaz said to her, "Bring your cloak and spread it out." He measured 6 scoops of barley into the cloak and placed it on her back. Then he returned to the town. Footnotes there, the 6 measures is an unknown quantity, and most Hebrew manuscripts say he there, while many Hebrew manuscripts in the Syriac version of the Latin Vulgate read she. And then he or she returned to the town. Well, they probably both did, but anyway. They did it before people could recognize her and know that she'd been there at the threshing floor overnight. When Ruth went back to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "What happened, my daughter?" Ruth told Naomi everything Boaz had done for her, and she added, "He gave me these 6 scoops of barley and said, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" So he's looking out for Ruth. He's also looking out for Naomi, his relative. Then Naomi said to her, "Just be patient, my daughter, until we hear what happens. The man won't rest until he has settled things today." Next chapter. Boaz went to the town gate. That's where they transacted business. That's where the elders sat, so that's where court was held. He went to the town gate and took a seat there. Just then the family redeemer he had mentioned came by, so Boaz called out to him, "Come over here and sit down, friend. I want to talk to you." So they sat down together. Then Boaz called 10 leaders from the town and asked them to sit as witnesses. So he's going to conduct a legal transaction here, and he wants there to be witnesses so that everything is beyond question. And Boaz said to the family redeemer, "You know Naomi, who came back from Moab. She is selling the land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should speak to you about it so that you can redeem it if you wish. If you want the land, then buy it here in the presence of these witnesses. But if you don't want it, let me know right away, because I'm next in line to redeem it after you." So remember the rules about land not being permanently sold. It needed to go to the sons, and if there were no sons, then there were procedures to deal with that. And apparently over time, this kinsman redeemer concepts came so that the closest relative could then take over the inheritance. So the land of Elimelech is available, and Elimelech is dead, so who's going to get it? And Boaz is saying to this man, "You're the closest relative. You're the nearest kinsman redeemer. It's your right to buy the land. And the man replied, all right, I'll redeem it. I'll buy it. I'll take it. Sounds good to me. Then Boaz told him, of course, your purchase of the land from Naomi also requires that you marry Ruth, the Moabite widow. That way she can have children who will carry on her husband's name and keep the land in the family. Well, okay. So he's laying out the additional requirements to go along with buying the land. You can buy the land, but of course it's going to belong to the heirs of Elimelech and of the sons. And the sons are dead, so they don't have children. So if you marry the widow, her children will then become heirs to the estate that you're buying. Then I can't redeem it, the family redeemer replied, because this might endanger my own estate. You redeem the land, I cannot do it. So if it involves raising up an heir to a dead man, he was worried that might endanger his own estate and his own son's inheritance. He didn't want to get involved in that. So then he says, well, okay, you do it. Now, in those days, it was the custom in Israel for anyone transferring a right of purchase to remove his sandal and hand it to the other party. This publicly validated the transaction. So the other family redeemer drew off his sandal as he said to Boaz, you buy the land. Now, that was not the original purpose of this removing the sandal. The original context of that is from the laws of Moses, where if a man refused to raise up heirs for a dead relative, then they would remove his sandal, his footwear, and he would be known as the unsandaled one. It was essentially a punishment. Well, now they're not using it as punishment. It's just a legal symbol. So he takes off his sandal and says to Boaz, you buy the land. Then Boaz said to the elders and to the crowd standing around, you are witnesses that today I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. And with the land I have acquired Ruth, the Moabite widow of Mahlon, to be my wife. This way she can have a son to carry on the family name of her dead husband and to inherit the family property here in his hometown. You are all witnesses today. Now, there are those who will interpret this story that at this point Boaz was single and he made Ruth his only wife. But it doesn't say that. And we know that in that day and time, polygamy was exceptionally common, and the whole bit about raising up children to a dead man's through a dead man's widow, the children would be considered the children of the dead man, was commonly done through polygamy. You're already married, so you take another wife and you have children by her in order to fulfill that obligation. So it is not a guarantee that Boaz only had Ruth as his wife. She was probably an additional wife, as she would have been for the other kinsman redeemer. Then the elders and all the people standing in the gate replied, we are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, from whom all the nation of Israel descended. May you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. And may the Lord give you descendants by this young woman who will be like those of your ancestor Perez, the son of Tamar and Judah. And you recall the story of Perez and Zerah, the two sons of Judah, through his widowed daughter-in-law, Tamar. So Boaz took Ruth into his home, and she became his wife. When he slept with her, the Lord enabled her to become pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women of the town said to Naomi, praise the Lord, who has now provided a redeemer for your family. May this child be famous in Israel. May he restore your youth and care for you in your old age. For he is the son of your daughter-in-law who loves you and has been better to you than 7 sons. Naomi took the baby and cuddled him to her breast, and she cared for him as if he were her own. The neighbor women said, "Now at last Naomi has a son again." And they named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David. Now we know why this book was put in there. It's the family line of David. Boaz, through Ruth, bore Obed. Obed bore Jesse, and Jesse bore David. Now this is the best link we have to placing this chronologically in the story of the Old Testament. But even that's not clear because we're not told how long those generations were. We can't even be certain, given the history and the genealogies of the Old Testament, that it's a complete genealogy. I mean, it does say that Obed became the grandfather of David. I suppose that's a statement that we're dealing with that many generations, in which case this would have been closer to the time of David than to the time of the taking of the Promised Land. But we'll find later when we look in genealogies that Boaz is named as the son of Rahab, which puts him very close to the entrance into the Promised Land. So, was he that old? I mean, we're dealing with a period of 500 years, and we're only looking at 5 or 6 generations. That doesn't sound right. Is there stuff missing in the genealogies, or was Boaz simply descended from the line that included Rahab? In fact, let me go to the genealogy, because I think that'll be included in the genealogy of Matthew. Yeah, here's how the genealogy of Matthew reads. It starts at Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the fathers of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. So it seems like we're missing some generations there, because we're going from Salmon, who apparently married Rahab, probably among other women. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, so that's shortly after the Israelite entry into the Promised Land. And then we've got Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. 5 generations to cover 500 years. Yeah, things have to be missing. They just have to be. It can't be entirely accurate. But yeah, I think we'll find that very frequently, for example, through the period of the exile in Egypt, that the people of Israel they were slaves, they didn't have real good genealogical records, but they did the best they could with the information they had, but that the genealogy is missing generations, and apparently even after that, the genealogies are missing generations. At some point, we'll get to the book of Chronicles, and the books of Chronicles include a lot of genealogical information. And we know why that was. Both Ezra and Nehemiah, the men who most likely had a hand in getting the books of Chronicles prepared, were totally fixated on genealogy, because of what they were doing to the 10 tribes. The 10 tribes, they said, had intermarried, were impure, and were ineligible to take part in rebuilding the land of Israel. And so they were being excluded. And thus, for that reason, then, genealogy became exceptionally important to them. And the books that they saw to being prepared, the historical books of Chronicles, are full of genealogy. It's very hard to read through them because of all the genealogy in them. So then the book of Ruth concludes. This is the genealogical record of their ancestor Perez. And we're essentially going to read the same thing. This is the Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. As in some Greek manuscripts, the Hebrew reads Salma. But, okay. The Greek manuscripts would say that, and that's probably where Matthew got his reference to write his account of the life of Jesus in Greek. Salmon was the father of Boaz. Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David. And so ends the book of Ruth. Now, is there a love story there? Well, maybe. We see evidence that Boaz may have had the hots for Ruth. May have. However, he may simply have been interested in seeing to the well-being of Ruth, of Naomi, as well as Ruth, and that marrying Ruth would be the way to see to Naomi in her old age, and that it would formalize things. So this may have been a marriage of convenience and legal requirements and not so much love. It is the first time so far in the Old Testament where we read of a woman having any level of agency, in that Ruth, at her mother-in-law Naomi's instruction, went to the threshing floor and initiated this whole bit about being married and having the kinsman redeemer get the land and the widow. So there was a level of agency for the woman there that was uncommon at the time. And I just looked over there to check my clock. We have been on for just under an hour and a half, which is about the amount of time we usually like to spend for this, and we have reached the end of a book. So that seems to me like a very good time to end our presentation. We'll begin with 1 Samuel, or if you have it in the German version, 1 Kings. In the German version, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Of course, in the German it's König, but that's how they name them. And when you read through them, you discover that 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are a single narrative of the history of Israel. And why we would call those books Samuel, only has to do with the story of Samuel at the beginning of the first book of Samuel. The thing is, by the end of the first book of Samuel, Samuel is dead. So why would we call the second book of Samuel a book of Samuel? He's already dead. He had nothing to do with it. Well, anyway, that's where we go next week. Also next week, the plan is, I say plan because I'm not guaranteeing that we will do this. The plan is that we will have a sermon presentation ready so that for the first Saturday in January, we will present that sermon presentation. And I don't know what it's going to be yet. I haven't sat down and worked it out and seen what I need to do. So we'll plan on that, however. And until next week, next Friday night, on our Friday night Bible study, where we invite you to join us, we say goodbye and God bless.